Buenos días. Muchas gracias a CropLife en Agricultura por la invitación. Lo siento por mi español. I will present in English. Okay, so today I'm really appreciate the talks already this morning. I think it's a great segue to what I'll discuss, and I'll be turning our attention to production of biologicals. So I have just a brief agenda. I'd like to further introduce myself and why I'm here. And I'd like to take some time to review regulations in the United States for biologicals. I think this will be a helpful framework for when we discuss what's important to consider when scaling up production. I'll talk about key points for risk management. And then I have a few case studies I'd like to share that I think will be useful perspective, and then I'll conclude. Okay, so I live here in Los Estados Unidos. It's Fort Collins, Colorado, about 1 hour north of Denver. And in the introduction you heard, I spent a long time working at Colorado State University. So my perspective is really coming from university research. I did also work at a startup company. We were scaling production of algae for biofuels. So I have some industrial perspective there. And most of my experience is coming from working with our regulatory agencies because of the type of work that we were doing in the laboratory, which was working with select agents. And so I'm a plant pathologist by training. I love microbiology and molecular biology, and I really truly believe in the power of microbes, good and bad. And okay, so that's my introduction. Okay, so why am I here? About 1 year ago, I was here working on a project through USAID through the Farmer to Farmer program. I was brought on as a biotechnology regulations expert. I was working closely with government officials, spent some time with Agricultura, and we were really looking at how regulation was being managed here in Guatemala for this new emerging field and how we can adapt that regulation to better support entrepreneurs, innovation, and companies in this emerging market. It was a really, really wonderful experience, and I'm so grateful to be back. And part of why I joined that program and why I wanted to do that work was I've spent most of the last 6 years in research administration. So I have a strong technical background, but I work really at the interface of research, of intellectual property, commercialization. We support startup companies, and I work kind of at that regulatory and administrative space. And I was feeling a little far removed, and so I decided to do this program, and I'm so glad I did, and so glad to be back. Okay, so I'd like to just review from the United States the key agencies that are involved in the regulation of biologicals. These are the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, and the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. So you'll hear me reference these three organizations in the next couple of slides. Okay, so first, just in general, the EPA is primarily in charge of regulating pesticides, and so they do this through two overarching pieces of legislation. Some of you are probably familiar with FIFRA, or the Federal Insecticide and Rodenticide Act. And this truly provides the framework for how pesticides are regulated in the United States. And this also, I wanted to point out, includes plant incorporated protectants, or PIPs. And this is where, for example, a genetically engineered crop. One of the greatest examples of this is BT corn, where an insecticidal substance is engineered into a crop. That is what is being regulated. The other legislation is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. And this has to do primarily with following production, any residues that are on a food product. And so these are the overarching pieces of legislation. Okay, so the EPA regulates biopesticides. By the way, this is the more common term in the US, is a biopesticide, not biological, but for today, those are considered the same. They do not regulate biostimulants. And this is a definition straight from the EPA that they define a biopesticide as certain types of pesticides derived from such natural materials as animals, plants, bacteria, and certain minerals. There are three major classifications of biopesticides. They're biochemical, microbial, and plant-incorporated protectants. Today, I'll focus mostly on microbial. Okay, so FIFRA says that before a pesticide can be marketed, the EPA has to go through evaluation of that product and make sure that it will not pose any unreasonable risks to human health or the environment. And my colleague Yvonne will follow today and talk more about environmental impacts and toxicology. There are a couple exemptions to FIFRA, so things that are not regulated, and those include pest control organisms such as nematodes, macroscopic parasites, insect predators, and pheromones. So what the EPA is looking for in terms of risk factors is they're looking for any potential adverse effects to non-target organisms. So again, this is looking at if you've got a microbe that you're going to be introducing into a new environment, ensuring that it's not going to harm anything else. And also what happens to the microbes when you put them into the environment? Do they rapidly decompose? Do they persist very long in the environment? So understanding the environmental fate is really important. And then any potential toxicity, pathogenicity, or infectivity to humans and animals. I'm not going to spend too much more time on this because Yvonne will cover a lot of those topics after. I do want to talk a little bit about genetically engineered or genetically modified, I'll use those terms interchangeably, crops and microorganisms. And of course, we learned a little bit this morning about the power of CRISPR, so edited organisms as well. So you're all probably familiar, regulation of any sort of genetically engineered crop or organism varies completely by country. In the United States, it's been widely used for many years, since the 1990s. We've had genetically engineered foods available to consumers. I've got a few examples here in this figure. It's a little dated, but I thought these numbers were pretty powerful. So as in 2020, genetically engineered soybeans made up 94% of all soybeans planted in the United States. These are really large numbers. And the same for cotton was 96% and corn 92%. So the overwhelming majority of large-scale agronomic production of these major crops are actually genetically engineered. Primarily, they're engineered for resistance to herbicides, resistance to other diseases, or other, those are probably the two biggest types of genetic engineering. So there are several gene-edited microbial products available on the market now. I'm showing one example. Pivot Bio is a company in the US. They have a product in the market. It's a biological nitrogen fixation. And this is really going to be, I think, a next phase of tremendous innovation. Is so not only looking at endemic microorganisms that can be beneficial to crop production, but also taking advantage of our knowledge of biology and genetics and manipulating them so that they can be even more beneficial. And regulation specifically of edited or engineered microbials is split in the United States between the EPA and USDA, and it's confusing. I'd say everyone is still learning about how to manage these, but not in the US, but of course at a global scale. It's just going to be, we've got a journey ahead of us, I think, but this is going to be a real source of tremendous innovation in the future. Okay, so in regards to data requirements, I actually spoke with someone at the EPA before I came just to make sure I fully understood. It's really not very different. So there's a few things that they want to be sure of. They want to understand what was the technology that was used in order to do whatever modification. So understanding sequences, the techniques that were used, and otherwise it's pretty much the same for getting registration for just a naturally occurring microbe. So they're looking, let me just see. And also if there's any specific control. So this is getting into a little molecular biology, but how is that gene regulated within the organism? What makes it turn on or off? And then any other new traits that are going to be introduced into that microbe. So these are kind of the basic pieces of information the EPA will be looking for. And then ultimately, of course, those toxicology tests, all of that is the same. Okay, so biostimulants now are not federally regulated. This is now where regulation becomes a state issue. So each state in the United States regulates biostimulants differently. So I'm doing my best to help navigate this landscape, but it's quite
Excelente.
complicated.
Es un panorama
I'm using a definition
bastante
from the
complejo en los
USDA
Estados
of
Unidos. Aquí tenemos la
biostimulants. So they
definición
define it
de
as
un
a substance or
bioestimulante que
microorganism
definen
that when
como
applied to
una
seed
sustancia o
plants or the
microorganismo que
rhizosphere
cuando se
stimulate the
aplica a
natural
semillas,
process
plantas
to enhance
o
benefit or
rizósferos,
benefit nutrient
estimula
uptake,
los procesos
efficiency,
naturales para
tolerance
mejorar
to
o
abiotic
beneficiar
stress,
en la
crop
absorción
quality,
de
and yield.
nutrientes, la eficiencia de
And they further
nutrientes,
classify those
la
into
tolerancia
microbial
a
living
tensión
microbes
abiótica
and then other natural
o la
products. So
calidad y
substances that
rendimiento
are
del
produced or
cultivo. Son
extracted from
sustancias
microbes,
que
plants,
son
or other
producidas
organisms.
naturalmente
Again, this is
a
regulated at
partir
a
de
state
microbios.
level.
Esto se norma en la esfera estatal,
Okay,
como
so
he
now
dicho
getting a
antes.
little
Muy
bit into
bien.
production.
Ahora
So
entremos
you've
un
worked with
poco a
Dr.
la
Ramon, you
producción.
found a
Trabajamos
great
con el doctor
microorganism, you think it
Ramón,
has potential for your crop.
ya
Now
nos
maybe you
habló de
want to start a company or
microorganismos y el
you
potencial
work in
para las
an R&D
plantas. Usted
team at a large
trabaja
company and you
en
want
un
to turn this
equipo de
into a product.
investigación y
Well, in the
desarrollo y
United States, the
quiere poder
EPA
producir
does
más en
not
los Estados
inspect
Unidos.
biopesticide
La
plants.
EPA
Again,
no
this is done at a
inspecciona
state level.
bioplaguicidas.
And so certain states
Las
have their own
instalaciones que
requirements.
producen
I'm just giving an example
bioplaguicidas,
where I
esto
live
se
in
hace en los
Colorado.
estados. Un ejemplo es
Biopesticide production
Colorado,
plants, all they have
donde
to do
las
is
plantas de
register with the
producción de
EPA and
bioplaguicidas
then
lo único
provide
que
annual
tienen que hacer
reports
es
for how much product they've
registrarse en
made.
la EPA y luego
That was it.
rendir informes
And so
anuales de
there's no other
cuántos
physical
productos se
requirements
producen.
for
No hay
human
otros
or environmental
requisitos
health by the
físicos
EPA for production of
en
biologicals.
relación
So
con
it's
la
pretty
salud
straightforward.
humana o ambiental emitida por la EPA.
So I'm going to use all of that backdrop now to talk
Todo
about
ese
risk
conocimiento
management.
lo
I really like
usamos
this
para
schematic.
hablar del
When we think about just
manejo de
sort
los
of
riesgos. Me
general risk
encanta
management,
este
it's
diagrama para
looking
hablar
at
del
first,
manejo
what
de
are our
los riesgos.
hazards? What
Vemos
are our
primero cuáles
risks?
son los peligros,
Further
cuáles son los
evaluating them,
riesgos,
and then
y luego
determining
los
what are proper
evaluamos para
methods of
determinar
control,
qué métodos de
implementing
control
those
son los más
controls, and then
adecuados,
reviewing
ponemos
what
en
we're doing
ejecución esos
and doing it all
controles,
over again.
y luego revisamos lo que
And I
hemos
really
hecho y
liked this
empezamos de nuevo.
schematic from Crop
A mí me
Life
encanta
in
también
Latin America. This
este
is outlining the
diagrama
major
de
steps of
Crop
production
Life
for a biological.
Latinoamérica que
So
muestra
essentially,
los
you could take
pasos que
that risk
intervienen en la
management framework that I
producción
just showed
de
and
los
apply this to each step of the
biológicos
process. So
y
typically, you have a raw material, your
muestran cada paso del
microorganism, your
proceso.
pure
Tiene
culture you've
la
gotten
materia
from Dr.
prima,
Ramon.
el
You've got your
bioreactivo,
bioreactors, you're
la
going through probably some kind of
extracción, el secado y el
fractionation, a
empaque.
drying
Usted
process,
va
and then
a
packaging. And drying, or it could be
tener
if you have a
todos
liquid
estos procesos
product.
y acá, claro que también puede tener un producto
I think
líquido.
more than anything, the most important
Yo
thing to
creo que más que
inform
nada, lo más
large-scale production is
importante
really reminding
es
ourselves that everything is
cuando
based in
hablamos de
science.
producción en
What are
gran
we
escala,
producing?
es
Where are we
recordarnos
producing
que
it? And how are
todo
we
se
producing
basa
it?
en la ciencia. ¿Qué estamos produciendo? ¿Dónde lo estamos
So I
produciendo?
kind of
¿Y cómo lo estamos
identified sort of what I
produciendo?
consider 5
He
major areas
identificado
of
más o
risk that you
menos
should be
5
looking at in
temas de
large-scale
riesgo
production of
principales que
biologicals.
debemos
They
analizar
include
en la producción
composition,
de
air,
biológicos,
personnel,
incluyendo
water,
su
and solid
composición,
waste.
el
And I'll
aire, el
go through each
personal,
of
el
these
agua
on the
y
next
los
few slides.
desechos sólidos, y voy a explicar cada uno de estos aspectos.
So back to that question, what are we making?
Regresemos
What
a
is
la
the
pregunta,
actual
¿qué estamos
organisms or
haciendo?
consortia of
¿Cuáles son los
organisms that we're
microorganismos que
growing at
estamos
scale?
produciendo a
Understanding that
escala?
fundamental biology of
Entender
those
esa
organisms
biología
is step number
fundamental de
1.
esos
And one of the things
microorganismos
that I
es
think
el
is
paso
really
número
critical
1 y yo
for
creo que una
many of those
cosa que es
risk
muy
management areas
importante
is whether or
en
not they're
estos
spore forming.
aspectos
And I'll talk about that a few more times.
sí forman esporas y
Also
voy a dedicar un
understanding where
poco
do
de
they come
tiempo a
from?
eso y tenemos que
Is this an
entender de
endemic
dónde
organism?
vienen.
Has
Este
it
es un
been imported from
organismo
somewhere else? Because
endémico,
that's
es
going to
un
inform further your
importado de otra
toxicology
parte,
studies. It's going to
porque
inform
esto
how
va a
much you need to contain within your
informar más sus
facility.
estudios de
So having
toxicología.
those important pieces of information
Así que
is
tener
essential.
esta información es crucial.
So in terms of
En
risk
lo que se
and of
refiere a los
what we're
riesgos,
producing,
en
understanding
lo que estamos
what is
produciendo,
our product,
entender
how we're producing it, and do we need, for example,
cómo se
significant
produce
cleaning
y qué
equipment and
necesitamos, si
supplies? Are we
necesitamos
using
hacer mucha
solvents in order to clean
limpieza,
our
si estamos
equipment?
utilizando
And then what happens to
solventes
those
para limpiar el
solvents
equipo y
once they
luego
leave
qué
the
ocurre con
facility?
esos
So
solventes.
whether or
Es
not you need to
importante
neutralize a substance
y
or
hasta que
neutralize,
necesite
let's say you have a bad
neutralizar la
batch. Let's say you
sustancia,
had
si
some
digamos
sort
que
of
tiene un lote
contamination, you need to
malo
get rid of a
en el que
product.
tuvo
How do you
alguna
get rid of it? What are
contaminación, tiene que deshacerse del
what are your
producto, cómo
list
se
of approved
deshace del producto,
disinfectants and
cuáles
understanding
son
how
los
that might
desinfectantes
impact your
aprobados
facility and your
y qué
people?
impacto podría tener eso de sus
Typically,
instalaciones en
so
su
some
gente.
facilities may have a water treatment
Generalmente,
site,
algunas instalaciones tal
water
vez
treatment facility on
tengan
site. or they might be just
instalaciones de
relying on a
tratamiento
local
del agua,
municipality
o
for
tal vez
making sure that water
dependen de
treatment
la
is being done
municipalidad
before it's
para
entering the
que
waste
ésta
stream.
le ofrezca el tratamiento
And
del
then
agua
again,
de
I'm
lo
reiterating
que
the impacts
descarta
of
de sus
ecologically,
operaciones
if we're putting more waste into the environment,
es
knowing what that
importante
composition is, it's going to tell you
entender
how you
cuál
should
es la
properly get rid of it.
composición del producto para saber cómo
And I'm
lo va a
including here
descartar.
again with the organisms a list of
Incluyo
like
aquí
accurately knowing
los
if it is genetically
organismos,
modified or
la
engineered or
necesidad de
edited,
saber
making sure
si
we
es un
understand what was done
producto
and that we have an accurate record, and then
genéticamente
also for
modificado para
everyone knowing what are
entender
approved
qué es lo que
disinfectants.
tienen que
So
hacer y tener un
in the
registro
lab that
de
I was
cuáles
running,
son los
our standard
desinfectantes
disinfectant was 10% bleach.
aprobados en
You know, that, and that was
nuestro
approved by the
laboratorio.
government. So if we had
Nosotros
if I had a
usábamos
large batch of
una
inoculum,
solución
we
con
were treating it with
10%
10% bleach for 30 minutes, and then it
de
was okay.
blanqueador
Or we were
y
autoclaving, and I'll talk about
nosotros
that in a minute.
utilizábamos eso y ya estábamos seguros de que
Okay,
se
so
había
air,
descartado
the
el
EPA
producto de manera
regulates
segura.
all air
El
quality
aire,
and sets
EPA,
standards for these 6 primary
mide
pollutants:
el aire para
carbon
estos
monoxide, particulate
6
matter, lead,
contaminantes, monóxido
nitrogen, dioxide,
de
ozone,
carbono,
and sulfur
materia
dioxide.
particulada, el plomo,
If you're mass
dióxido
producing
de
microbes,
nitrógeno,
chances
ozono.
are you're not producing any of these major
Sí,
pollutants. So
bueno,
I'm
ustedes
just
no
sharing this as
producen
information,
estos
but this is
contaminantes,
really
solo
probably of low
esto
risk
como información.
for production of
Pero
biologicals.
ustedes
But
probablemente
relevant to
no
the
tienen el
pesticide
riesgo
industry, so
de
there is a
la
natural emission
producción
standards for
de
hazardous air
estos
pollutants, or HAPs, they're
contaminantes.
called.
Hay
And the pesticide active
información
ingredient production
útil
industry
para
is
los
subject to
contaminantes
regulation of
peligrosos o HAPs en
release of
inglés,
toluene,
y
methanol,
tenemos
methyl chloride, and hydrogen chloride. And
información
these are all
específica para
considered
el
toxic
tolueno, el
and
metanol,
can
el
cause toxic effects during
de
exposure. So
metilo y
these
el
are
cloro
more
de
regulated, and this
hidrógeno
would be more relevant for some
pueden
pesticide
causar
production
efectos
facilities.
tóxicos después de su
But again,
exposición.
biopesticide production or
Pero
biologicals
repito,
are not
la
subject to this
producción de
regulation. And it's
bioplaguicidas
really only
no están
facilities that are
sujetos a
producing
esta
organic
normativa,
pesticides.
solo
And those
las
are typically
instalaciones
in
que
herbicides,
fabrican
insecticides,
ingredientes
and
activos
other
para
fungicides.
plaguicidas orgánicos que se utilizan como
Okay, so I'm going
herbicidas,
to kind of overlap
insecticidas o
air and
fungicidas.
personnel,
Ahora,
since
aquí
most
voy a
production, of
hablar un
course, is
poco
going to be
del aire y
indoors.
el
There's not going to,
personal,
again, we
porque la
review,
mayor
there's not
parte
going to be
de
a
la
lot emitted
producción
into
va a
the
ser
environment. So
en el
we're going to be
interior,
looking
así
at
que no
any
se
risks
debe emitir al
to
exterior, así que
employees during
tenemos que
production.
identificar cualquier
And so
riesgo
HEPA
para
filters,
los
so that
empleados
stands for
durante
high
la
efficiency and
producción.
particulate air. This is a really very
Los
sensitive
filtros
filter. It's in order to
de
be considered
aire
HEPA, it has to be able to
particular de
filter
alta eficiencia o
99.97%
HEPA deben
of
captar por lo
fine
menos
airborne particles with a size of 0.3
99.97%
microns.
de las
And
partículas
so
que vuelan
some
en el
facilities
aire
may have a closed air
con un
circulation
tamaño de
system, and
0.3
that's amazing. That's
unidades
like
después
fantastic,
de
but not
certificación.
actually
Hay
necessary for
algunas
production of
instalaciones que tienen
biologicals.
sistemas cerrados de
But what we're
circulación del aire,
probably
pero
more
eso no es
concerned about is
totalmente
really, again,
necesario.
employee
Lo que
safety here,
más
because
nos
indoor air
preocupa
quality
aquí es la
risk will be very
seguridad de los
low
empleados,
when you're just growing
porque
up a
el
bunch of
riesgo
microbes. But
de contaminación
if
interna sería
employees
muy
have certain
bajo, pero los
sensitivities, again, if an
empleados
organism
tal
is
vez
spore
podrían
forming,
tener
that will be
algunas
important to be aware of and
sensibilidades
manage. And so
la
I'm going to talk
formación
about
de
OSHA
esporas, y
shortly,
por eso
what
voy
that
a
means for
hablarles
just
en un
employee
momento de
safety.
OSHA
But
y lo
really
que
making sure,
significa
for
para la
example,
seguridad de
if
los
you are
empleados. Entonces,
mass
por
producing
ejemplo,
a fungus
si
and
usted
it's
está
spore forming,
produciendo
if that employee
hongos
has
y está
sensitivities that you're
formando
capturing those
esporas
spores in a
y este
carrier that is not
empleado es
aerosolizing
sensible a
them
esas
into the air.
esporas,
And
pues
so one example would be in
un
mineral oil.
ejemplo sería lo que pasaría en ese caso.
Okay, so if I outline
Muy
my
bien,
table
aquí
here, risk
está
is
un
working with a
esquema que ya
microorganism.
les
If
mostré
they're spore
los
forming,
riesgos
making
de
sure
los
we're containing
microorganismos, que puede
those
ser
spores
que
properly.
forma
That can be
esporas, las
really readily
propiedades
done if
de
work
estas
is being
esporas. Esto se puede
conducted
hacer
in a
fácilmente
biosafety
y se
cabinet
hace
or
trabajo
or
a través
flow
de
hood, and that those
gabinetes de
pieces of
bioseguridad
equipment are well
y
maintained. And I'm
los
going to
equipos se
emphasize, I
mantienen
actually
bien.
can't
Y quiero
emphasize this enough, that
recalcar
the
esto
importance of
mucho,
maintaining proper equipment and that they're being serviced
importancia de darle
regularly.
buen
That will
mantenimiento a sus
absolve all
equipos
your
para
risks. If your
poder
equipment works well,
absorber
then
todos
you're
sus
taking away
riesgos,
that
porque
risk
si
and safety.
su equipo funciona bien, está
And so,
retirando el riesgo.
also, I just wanted to comment about volatile
También
compounds. This
quería
may or may not be an issue, but something to
comentar sobre los
consider, again, that work
compuestos
should be being done in a
volátiles.
proper
Tal vez
flow
eso
hood.
no sea problema, pero es algo a tomar en cuenta.
And I'm
Y
just going to emphasize one more time
quiero
that endemic
también
organisms are
recalcar los
really inherently
organismos
pose a low risk
endémicos que
and
podrían
to
plantear
ambient air
algún
quality.
tipo de riesgo a la calidad del aire ambiental.
Okay, just a moment about personnel.
Aquí queremos hablar un
I
momento
think it's
sobre el
important
personal. Creo que
to
es
take a look at your team.
importante darle un
How are they
vistazo a su
trained? What is their
entorno.
background? What do they know
¿De
about the
dónde
actual
vienen
product
sus
that they're
empleados? ¿Qué
producing?
saben
And
del
so
producto que están
if
produciendo?
I identify the risk there is what
Una
is their
vez que
level of
se
competency or
identifica un
training?
riesgo,
And so a
¿cuál
way
es
to
el
mitigate
nivel
that
de
was just making sure that
competencia, de
everyone knows what are
capacitación que
proper
tiene su jefe?
protocols,
Queremos estar
making
seguros
sure they
de
have
que
access to
sus
to
empleados
resources and safe
conocen
work practices. Just kind of general behavior.
lo que deben
What
y
is your
pueden
team?
hacer, la
Do
conducta
they
general.
understand
El
the risks that are posed to
equipo
themselves, to
entiende
the
los
environment? Do they
riesgos
respect those risks? And are
planteados
they going
para
to
ellos,
stay
para el
on
medio
board with proper safety
ambiente, y
protocols?
tienen los
And just kind of
cuidados
creating a culture
necesarios, siguen los
of good
protocolos
work
de
practices.
seguridad. En otras palabras,
And then just
crear una
again,
cultura de
understanding
buenas
overall health of
prácticas y
employees is
entender en
important. So if someone
general
does have particular
la salud de los
sensitivities,
empleados
that would
es
be another area
importante.
to
Si
make sure
alguien es
that is
particularmente
on
sensible,
record.
ese es otro
They're
tema
particularly sensitive or
que
have
se debe
allergies, that's
considerar
being
si
addressed
tiene
properly.
muchas alergias esta persona. Bueno, pues
And
eso
a lot
habría
of that
que
can also
tomarlo
be
en
mitigated with just
cuenta,
proper
y
personal
mucho de
protective
esto se puede
equipment. And
mitigar
so in
con
production of
equipo de
biologicals, that's really
protección
standard,
personal.
right?
En la
There's no need for a
producción de
Tyvek suit
biológicos, eso es
in this
estándar, no
instance,
se
but
necesita
gloves,
un
lab coats,
traje
safety
hermético, pero
glasses, pretty
sí
standard PPEs
ah,
is appropriate.
anteojos de protección o guantes.
Okay, I
Se
mentioned
consideran
OSHA earlier. This is
mecanismos de
Occupational
protección. Le
Safety and Health
mencioné
Administration, and
la
this is an
OSHA.
organization
Esta es la
out of the Department of
Administración de
Labor.
la Seguridad y
And
Salud
so this is the
Ocupacional, que es
organization that
parte del
really
Departamento del
oversees
Trabajo de los
all
Estados
worker
Unidos.
safety, no
Es
matter
una
the industry.
organización que
And I just wanted to bring this
supervisa
up
la
because
seguridad de los
essentially this
trabajadores en
organization has
todas las
jurisdiction in the United
industrias. Esta
States over
organización
7
tiene
million different work
jurisdicción
sites.
en los
They're
Estados
obviously
Unidos
going to be
sobre
focusing their
7 millones
attention
de
on high
sitios
risk
de
industries.
trabajo y
So
enfocan su
if
atención
a new
en
company is going
industrias de
into
altos
business, typically
riesgos. Si
OSHA will
una
come and do
nueva
an initial
compañía
inspection,
entra
say,
al
yep, looks good, you
negocio,
have fire
viene la
extinguishers, you
OSHA a
have
hacer una
PPE, good
inspección
job.
inicial y
They're not going
dice,
to return
así
unless they
tienen
have a reason to. They're
extintores
really,
de
again, focused on high
incendios,
risk
tienen equipo
industries.
de
So they're
protección
looking for
personal.
what are the imminent
Sí,
dangers? Are these
ellos
people
tal vez ya no
operating
vayan a
monster
regresar a menos que
heavy
se plantee
equipment and
algún problema.
machinery?
Si se
Do
trata de
they,
una
are
empresa que
there records
utiliza
already of
maquinaria
potential
enorme o
severe injuries?
muchísima
That's when they're going to
maquinaria, y
come
hay
back and
otros
continue to be inspecting.
riesgos
So
como por
again,
ejemplo
this
peligros
is
inminentes
probably
o
going to be a
lesiones
one-time
severas.
visit and done in the
Ellos
United States by OSHA.
probablemente vendrán a hacer inspecciones particulares ahí,
Okay,
pero
moving on
una
to
sola
water.
vez.
So the EPA
Pasemos al
monitors
agua.
compliance with
La
the Clean
EPA
Water Act
da
and
seguimiento
Safe
al
Drinking Water
cumplimiento de
Act.
la ley
And
sobre
so
agua potable y
compliance in
agua
this case for water
potable
is again
segura para
implemented by
beber,
state.
y
So
el
the EPA is
cumplimiento
looking at
es
overall
ejecutado por los
making sure people are
estados
are
para
adhering to these
asegurar
pieces
que
of
las
legislation,
personas
but
cumplen
states are the
con
ones that are
la
actually implementing
legislación, y los estados
inspections. And
son
so
los que realizan las
production
inspecciones.
in
Entonces,
a
en la
biosafety, or
producción
excuse me, in a biological
de
facility, that'll be
en
working closely with
instalaciones de
your local
biológicos, ellos van a
municipality.
trabajar muy
And
de cerca con su
typically, at
municipalidad.
really large scale production, there's some sort
Generalmente
of
en
industrial
producción de
pre-treatment that's happening before water is
alta
entering
escala,
a
sí
main
se
waste
tiene que
stream.
dar
This
tratamiento
is a picture
especial
in
al
my
agua antes de
hometown
que se vaya a los
of our
flujos de agua
water
normales. Aquí
pre-treatment plant.
tenemos una planta de
So what we're
pretratamiento
looking at in terms
industrial
of risk
a la
then, if
vista
you
en
think about
cuanto
mass
a
production
riesgos,
of
y
biologicals,
cuando
well,
pensamos
they might be
en la
in a liquid
producción
format.
masiva de
I used that
biológicos
example
que pueden
earlier. If
estar
you
en
had a potential contaminated
formato
batch, you had to
líquido, pues si
disinfect
uno
it
puede
and
tener un
put it
lote
into the waste stream.
contaminado,
So you
como
want to
dije
make sure
antes,
that
y hay que descartarlo. Quiere estar
that neutralization that's
seguro
happening or that
de
disinfection
que
that's happening, or whatever
se
denaturing you're
hace la
doing is first of all, it's
desinfección
effective, and that
necesaria,
whatever
y
you
que la
use is safe to be going into
desnaturalización
a
del
waste stream.
biológico es segura antes de
And
que
then again, I'm going back
corra
to
el agua
cleaning
en los flujos
solutions
normales de
because I think
agua.
it all really depends
Regresemos a
on the
hablar de
product that
las
you're making
soluciones de
and what
limpieza.
you've got
Depende del
approved for
producto
use
que están
for
haciendo y
cleaning,
lo
but
que tiene
that's another
aprobado
area to
para
be paying attention
limpiar
to.
el entorno, y es algo que le tiene que prestar mayor atención.
So in terms of solid waste, when you're
En lo que se refiere a
working
los
with different
desechos
strains,
sólidos,
you
si
probably
usted
have a
está
lot of
trabajando
petri
con
dishes,
diferentes
a lot of
cepas y
solid
tiene
waste that you're going through.
muchos
And so the easiest way
aparatos, la
to get
forma
rid of that
más
and be
fácil
safe is just using an autoclave. And
descartarlos
so
es
emphasize
utilizar un
again, having
autoclave.
proper
Recalco la
equipment
importancia de
that's
tener
been
equipo
well maintained,
adecuado, que
or if
tenga
you're using
buen
an incineration
mantenimiento, o
service,
si
that's
está
great.
utilizando un
But those are
servicio
the
de
key,
incineración, eso
I mean,
está
that's really the
bien.
biggest way to mitigate a
Pero
risk for solid waste.
esa es la mejor
I
manera
also
de
wanted to comment about
deshacerse de
antibiotics.
los
Often there's some selection that's happening in production. And so if you're using a lot of antibiotics, insects, making sure that that's denatured before going in the waste stream.
debe asegurar que
When I So when in
lo
our
hace
lab,
de manera
we
incorrecta.
actually had to record
Nosotros tenemos
every
que registrar
autoclave run of material.
todos
So we
los
had a log, and we
autoplanes
were
que se
using
corren
the stair gauge strips. So that was just basically saying yes,
nosotros
temperature and
decimos
pressure
aquí
was
sí,
reached,
la
and we had to track that for every
temperatura
single
se
load that we
alcanzó
did.
para cada
And then every
carga
6 months, I had to
aplicamos y cada
conduct a
6
spore
meses
forming
yo tengo
test. So
que
this was basically to
realizar
show
una
the
prueba
enough again
de
temperature and pressure
presencia
was
de
reached
esporas,
to kill any
es
spore.
decir, que se
So those are pretty
utilizaron las
straightforward, easy
temperaturas y
tools to
tiempos
use
correctos
for
para
daily
eliminar
checks
las esporas. Esto
alongside
es lo
proper
que se
maintenance of an
hace
autoclave.
junto con el mantenimiento normal del
I wanted to make a note
autoclave.
about product formulations,
Quiero
because depending
también
on your type
hablar
of
acerca
product,
de
you
las
might be using other
formulaciones de los
ingredients in
productos,
order to
porque
stabilize your
dependiendo
product if it's
del
not
producto que
in
va a
a
hacer, puede ser
solid
que
form, if it's
utilice
in liquid form.
estabilizadores,
And so
si
that's another
está
thing to be
en forma
aware of, is
sólida
what
o
are those
líquida. Esto
ingredients,
es
what are they
otra cosa
made
que
of?
tiene que
If
conocer
we have
cuáles
to,
son los
again, get rid of
ingredientes
them
que
for
se
some reason, that we're
utilizan y
following
ya
good
los
protocols.
riesgos que existen y
And then also
asegurar
making
que
sure
sigue buenos
that we're
protocolos y también
neutralizing anything that might be considered caustic.
que se asegura que
But if those ingredients
neutraliza
are
cualquier
inert,
cosa que va a ir al
there's not really any
ambiente. Y
other
si esos
requirement, I would say.
ingredientes son inertes, no hay otras exigencias.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about
Muy bien, ahora quiero
what
hablar
I
un
spent a
poco
really long time
acerca
doing, which was
de
working with
un
what the
trabajo que
United
hice
States
durante
Department of
bastante
Agriculture
tiempo, que
considers
es
select
trabajar
agents.
con el
So
Departamento
the US
de
government has a
Agricultura y
list
la
of
investigación
human
universitaria
pathogens,
con
animal
agentes
pathogens, and plant
seleccionados.
pathogens that are not
Nosotros
currently present in the
tenemos
US, and we don't want them
patógenos
there.
que
And so these
no
are
están
highly,
presentes
highly
en los Estados
regulated if you're
Unidos y
conducting
no
research with
los
them. So
queremos
we were
en
doing this under very
Estados
controlled
Unidos.
settings. And I'm
Por
using
eso
this
hacemos
example because I think it's good
mucha
proxy, because we were
investigación
producing
en
a lot of these
entornos muy
organisms, and
controlados. Este es
we
un
had to do
proxy porque
everything at
nosotros
highest
producimos muchos de
containment.
estos
We were
organismos y
working
teníamos
at
que
what's
hacer
considered a
este
biosafety
trabajo de
level 2.
investigación con mucha
So just for other examples,
contención, con
human pathogens on this list,
medida de bioseguridad
Ebola,
de nivel 2
animal
en
pathogens,
el
African swine
laboratorio.
fever.
Entonces,
These are things that
por
are
ejemplo,
considered severely
en
high
el caso
risk.
del ébola, que
And
son las
so we
cosas,
have to,
es algo
this
que
is where I got a lot
significa
of my
mucho
training in
riesgo.
risk management,
Aquí
is
es
like,
donde
what
yo
is
recibí
every place
mucho
that these
de mi
organisms could
conocimiento
potentially go out into the
porque
environment?
tenía que
The
analizar
ones I worked
cualquier
on
sitio en el que
were
pudiera
rice
salir este
pathogens. I spent most of
patógeno
my technical career
al
working on two
entorno.
really important
Yo trabajé
bacterial
con
pathogens of
patógenos
rice, bacterial blight and
de
bacterial
agentes
leaf streak. These are huge
seleccionados
problems in Africa and Asia primarily.
África y
And
Asia
so
particularmente,
I
y
ran this entire lab. We had
yo
people from all over
corrí
the
todo
world.
este laboratorio
Everyone
y
had to
tenía
have an
gente de
FBI
todas
background
partes
check.
del mundo y
And the
todos
reason for
tenían
that was to
que
make sure that no one was a
pasar por una revisión
bioterrorist.
por
In
la
other words,
FBI para
if
estar
somebody
seguros de que no
wanted to
teníamos
do
un
harm to the
bioterrorista, porque
agricultural
si alguien quisiera
industry,
comerle,
they could, in theory,
causar
take these
daño a la
organisms and
industria
release them into the
agrícola,
environment.
podría
So
venir a
that
querer
was what they were
trabajar a
trying to
estos
do. So we
entornos.
all,
Así
I
que
had to make sure even our undergraduate
todos
students
queríamos
had to have an
asegurarnos.
FBI background check in order to have access to the material. We were conducting research in a lab, in a greenhouse, and in controlled environmental settings. So we had huge growth chambers. So all of those facilities were inspected annually by APHIS. So that's the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. In addition, we would sometimes get random inspections by the CDC or the Center for Disease Control. And I had to show proof of our inventory of every single vial, over 3,000 different vials of organism. We had to have up-to-date records of standard operating procedures for everything we were doing, from growing material, disposing of material, inoculating plants, you name it, molecular biology. And then we had to have biosafety plans, biosecurity plans. I mean, pages and pages and pages of what we would do in case of a tornado and it ripped the roof off of our greenhouse. Like, what would we do to contain it? And just so you know, in all of that, considering how much we were under regulation, the water and the air was never tested in our facility. We were right in the middle of a public campus, like open to the public, right in the middle of Fort Collins, conducting this really high security research. But, what we did was address all of those risks, and that was it. And so we worked closely with our facilities teams on campus to make sure that everyone understood what we were doing, how we were managing it. I already mentioned that we relied heavily on our well-working autoclaves, but we had no other location requirements. And also the only other thing that was strictly enforced was when we were going, for example, from the lab to the greenhouse. So we had to make sure our material was well contained when we were in transport. So that's just for some perspective. And then moving on to a more commercial perspective. So I mentioned earlier in our role with the university is to manage all the intellectual property. And we also support startup companies. So this company, Grosentia, was developed based on a piece of IP. It's a consortia of microbes that solubilize and fix nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus. So this company was doing a lot of bioprospecting, and they had a massive collection. And their only requirement, so they're based in Colorado, and their only requirement for production was to register their location. And that was it. They had no other inspection. They were just kind of told, like, just keep doing a good job. And that was it. And so I just wanted to use that as another perspective from extreme high security research to a startup company producing biologicals, all of this working with different microbes. Just, there's I would say there's regulation, but also understanding the biology is what really informed where those risks were and how they were mitigated. Okay, so I'll kind of start to conclude some of what I've talked about today. I think if I just could call out 3 priorities for commercial production of biologicals, it would be number 1, complying with any worker standards in your particular place of location, having really accurate records of composition and formulation of all of your microbes, any genetically modified microbes, and all of your formulations. And then accurate and well understood by all employees, cleaning protocols, and then making sure you know where and how your water is being treated. And then just in general, I think it's important for, especially for emerging industries, that everyone is really, no pun intended, speaking the same language. Like, that everyone agrees that we are defining these products the same. So for example, making sure that, when I say biopesticide, I'm meaning the same thing as a biological, or, for a plant extract, a biostimulant. And I think that really provides the fundamental path forward for how things should be regulated. And then making sure that all of that regulation is being done with sound science and constantly asking questions. What are we doing and why? And then I want to, speaking it from someone who lives in a town where we have over 30 microbreweries. Beer is very popular in Colorado, and specifically in the town that I live in. I think this is a really great proxy for biologicals. So if you think about production of beer, they are mass producing in fermentation vessels using a microorganism, primarily yeast. And so those protocols, and it's actually a food product, so it's probably even more highly regulated, or needs to be, because it's going to be consumed than a biological product. But I think those practices, those protocols are a really great proxy for how we inform production in biologicals. Okay. Oh. And one last comment about innovation, because this is where I really live now, at this interface again of science, of research, of commercialization. We are working to try to get technologies from a university out into the world to have impact. And so I truly believe in the power of innovation, and I am really excited about this space in particular. And the biologist and microbiologist in me especially loves this, because when you think about every type of growing system, every type of climate and changing climates, and all of the incredible discovery that is ahead of us in this field, it's really incredible. And so I think we just need lots of research, understanding different ecologies, how microorganisms are benefiting one another, benefiting our environment, and then how those can adapt, because we know it's changing. I think intellectual property is a really powerful tool for commercialization. Of course, if you're looking to do that globally, that can require significant investment. And I think ultimately the challenge here isn't necessarily in discovery. And I think there's a real culture. We've already heard this morning how much innovation is being embraced and encouraged in this space, but it's really going to come down to scale. So how do we take that information from a laboratory, from R&D teams, and make that into a product that can scale and then persist in the environment and actually be effective? I think that's the real challenge. I took my first integrated pest management class over 20 years ago. And it's partly why I'm here with you today, because I really believe in the power of integrating different tools in order to solve our food challenges. So it doesn't mean that we are solely doing something only with biologicals or only with chemicals. I think there's a really, there's a way that we can integrate all of these tools together to be successful. And I'm just really excited about CropLife's the sustainable pesticide management framework. I think is really smart. It's really comprehensive, and it's really going to help enable these tools to be implemented globally. And that's it. Thank you so much.